When you walk into the liquor store, you are surrounded by an ocean of whiskey. I have 7 tips to help you plot a course through that ocean to finding a great bottle. Hey guys, welcome back to Whiskey on the West Coast. My name is Matt. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome here. This, as I mentioned, is a beginner's guide, is kind of an introduction video into how you can find your next bottle of whiskey and make sure it's a good, if not great bottle. I got 7 tips or tricks that I've learned over the years from buying whiskey, watching videos, and reading articles that I want to pass on to you. Now, this is different than my past videos. This is necessarily for the whiskey geeks, the anoraks, those are well versed in whiskey. Stick around, let me know your thoughts on this video and whether or not you have any tips to add to the list. You comment down below. But otherwise, this is kind of a beginner's video, a helpful guide and aid for you guys to find your next whiskey. This video kind of had its genesis from some electronic mails, some DMs, and some friends that I had who were asking, well, how do you even pick a bottle? Where do you even start? And I want to answer that question. I want to help point you guys in the direction of finding that next great whiskey. Now, this list isn't exhaustive, isn't going to guarantee success, but I believe if you follow these 7 tips, you have the best chance of making your next whiskey a really enjoyable one. Let's get to number 1. Tip number 1, don't assume you have to pay a higher price to get a better whiskey. Now, I know when I first started out buying whiskeys, I made this assumption. I assumed that if it cost more money, well, it must be better. And that's just simply not the case. Sometimes it is, but oftentimes there's great quality whiskeys that are available at a lower price than you'd expect. Case in point, Macallan A Night on Earth in Scotland runs about $160 Canadian in my market, and Macallan's a big name distillery. People recognize the name. On my right here is Kilkerran 12-year-old single malt Scotch whiskey. This runs about $100 Canadian in my market where you can find it. I would drink the Kilkerran 7 days out of a 7-day week over this Macallan. And the reasons why I would prefer this over the Macallan will become clearer as we get further down this list. But for now, let's just go ahead and say that you don't necessarily have to pay more to get more when it comes to Scotch whiskey. My second tip for you is going to be to look for the malt. Now, malt is just another way of saying malted barley. It's the grain used to create single malt Scotch whiskey or blended malt Scotch whiskeys. Now, when we're talking about malt versus the opposite, it's going to be malt versus grain. And so just using a different type of grain. And so in Scotch whiskey, something that's classified as a grain, it's going to be a blended grain whiskey, or it's going to be a single grain whiskey. There's some of those out there. Or it's going to be known as a blended Scotch whiskey if it's a mixture of grain and malt. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because in my experience, you have a much more complex and a much more enjoyable, a much more flavorful experience when there's a higher proportion of malt in your whiskey as opposed to grain. That's why I believe single malt whiskeys are just so popular, is because largely there's an agreement in the community that single malts are just more enjoyable. Now, it's not that a grain whiskey is a bad thing. There's some great single grain whiskeys, especially Loch Lomond has a single grain whiskey that's made entirely from malted barley. It has to be named a single grain because of the type of still they use. So to kind of, as a visual representative here of this, I have an 18-year-old Dewar's blended Scotch whiskey here. And you'll see on the front of the label, it says blended Scotch whiskey. Again, indicating that it's a blend of both malt and grain. To its left, I have this blended malt here, which does say blended malt Scotch whiskey. It's a blend of 2 distilleries, so it can't be a single malt because there's more than one distillery. This is Bunnahabhain and Kalila, both Islay single malt Scotch whiskey distilleries. Put together, it's a blended malt. And on my right here is the Kilkerran 12 that we already talked about. And this is a single malt Scotch whiskey. So 100% malted barley coming from one distillery, single malt. My preference is to drink malt barley Scotch whiskey. I just think it's a much better flavor profile. And I think most would agree with me on that. So second tip, look for the malt. Third tip on the list, does it have an age statement? Now, an age statement is usually just represented by a number on the front of the bottle. You can see it on the Kilkerran bottle here of the youngest whiskey that is inside that bottle. So on the Kilkerran, it's a 12-year-old single malt Scotch whiskey, which means the youngest whiskey in that bottle is 12 years old. It can be older. They don't have to declare what the oldest whiskey is, but the youngest is a minimum of 12 years old. Age is important. It's not everything, but it often is a sign of quality. If they're willing to put an age statement on a whiskey, it's just giving you more information to go off of. So how long it's aged, how much time the oak cask has had to work with the distillate, with the spirit, to help round off any sharp edges, to help impart flavor, and otherwise change the whiskey into something that can be quite magnificent. Now, on our left, we're kind of beaten up on Macallan, and I'm kind of sorry, but I'm also not, because they pissed me off with this bottle. But the Macallan A Night on Earth in Scotland, there is no age statement on this bottle. So what can we assume? Well, by law in Scotland, a Scotch whiskey can only be called whiskey at an age of 3 years old. So what we know is there's a minimum of 3-year-old whiskey in this bottle. This is what we call a non-age statement whiskey, or NAS whiskey, and they came about because there was a limited amount of stock of whiskey because whiskey was becoming very popular. Scotch whiskey was flying off the shelf, and they were running out of stocks in the warehouses, and so they had to either drop age statements or they had to come up with new whiskeys that included both old and young whiskeys in the vatting. Hence, we have non-age statement whiskeys. It's kind of a 4-letter word in the whiskey community at times. That's changing, however, and I'm going to tell you again, there's always an exception to these rules. You need to know what you're looking at with a non-age statement whiskey. However, there are fantastic non-age statement whiskeys, and some are getting better and better with more options on the market. A great option here that came out quite a number of years ago is Tomatin Contrasts, where they released a bottle that was vatting of, I'm just going to check the years here, whiskeys from 1973, 77, 88, 91, 2002, and 2006. So there's a lot of different age statements they could have thrown on this bottle if they were allowed to. However, the youngest whiskey in this, when this was bottled, was 9 years old. Now, if I do the math, 2015 to 1973, the oldest whiskey in this is what, 42 years old? It's a huge difference. But there's value in that. They're blending these different stocks together to come up with a very flavorful and different product. And it works. I am really just blown away by the dynamic that these two bottles have. Similarly with Victoriana by Glen Scotia, they have older whiskey in here. I think in and upwards about 15-year-old whiskey, but they also have younger whiskey in it. But those two kind of complement each other. You get some youthfulness from the young whiskey that helps brighten things up, helps liven up the whiskey. But you have some very delicate, complex, and also just austere elements from the older whiskey. So, non-age statement, not a bad thing, but you got to be careful and you got to know what you are buying at the time. If it has an age statement, it's just giving you more information to work off of, and you have a better chance of buying a good whiskey. Tip number 4 is to ask yourself when you're in the store, what strength is this whiskey bottled at? So for Scotch whiskey, the lowest possible alcohol percentage that something can be bottled at is 40% alcohol, which we have here with the Dewar's 18-year-old. It is bottled at 40%. That is the floor. That is the legal minimum strength it can be bottled at. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why is alcohol percentage important? Well, what percentage your whiskey, your Scotch whiskey, is bottled at and presented to you at is going to have a very large impact on what kind of whiskey and what kind of tasting experience you're going to get. If you're looking for something that's smooth, that drinks like water, that is just going to be easy to drink a lot of, then you may want 40% alcohol. But if you want a whiskey that has a lot of texture, that has a lot of viscosity that carries with it a lot of complex aromas and flavors. If you want something that represents the utmost flavor delivery, you're going to probably want something that's higher in alcohol percentage. Again, there's exceptions to every rule, but generally I look for something that is not 40% alcohol. So taking a step up there, you have our Macallan A Night on Earth in Scotland here, bottled at 43%. And there are some wonderful whiskeys that are bottled at 43%. I don't necessarily turn my nose up at them, but I think they can do a little bit better, because another step up at 46% alcohol with this Kilkerran 12-year-old. 46% is actually a really key number when it comes to alcoholic strength, because that is the moment when a distillery can actually decide whether or not it wants to chill filter its whiskey. 46% Kilkerran is not chill filtered. And we're going to talk about chill filtration in one of the upcoming tips. But for now, I'm going to leave it and just let you know 46% can be non-chill filtered. And there are a lot of fantastic whiskeys that are bottled at exactly this strength for that reason. Moving on, historically, kind of like the Goldilocks zone for a perfect drinking whiskey has oftentimes been referred to as a whiskey that's bottled at 47.5 to 48.5%. And so with the independently bottled Ardmore here by Carnmore, this is bottled at 47.5%. Now, I should go back a little bit here. When a whiskey is taken out of a cask, it is at something called cask strength. So it is at a higher percentage. That's probably not a nice round number when it's pulled out. Now, before it gets bottled, it oftentimes will be watered down. It'll be proofed down with water. And so they'll bring it down to a nice round number like the 40%, the 43%, or the 46%. In this case, they added water to this whiskey until it got to 47.5%, because they believe that is the best percentage to be able to pour this whiskey and drink it. That's the most enjoyable drinking strength. Going further than that, Bruichladdich, they bottle at 50% alcohol. And one of the things I love about this is when you're getting up towards strengths of 46, 47.5, and 50%, it puts the control back in your hands as the whiskey drinker, because you can add your own water to it to find your own preferred drinking strength. Now, what's even better than 50%? Cask strength whiskey, in that if you like to drink it as if it just came out of that oak cask at the distillery, you can. You can also add your own water to it to find your preferred drinking strength. A negative, you can't just pour and drink it if you don't like to drink it at that cask strength. You'd have to add water to it. So your preferences definitely come into this situation. But a cask strength whiskey gives you a lot of options and oftentimes gives you more value. Finally, again, there's exceptions to every rule. In the middle here, I have an independently bottled blended malt called Sirius. It's a 31-year-old blended malt. I have a review of it that is posted on my channel. It is a cask strength whiskey that is non-chill filtered, which we talked about 46% being the minimum threshold for that. However, it is 43.1% alcohol. It's a cask strength whiskey. So how can this one be cask strength at 43.1%, and yet this Lagavulin over here is cask strength at 56.5%? Well, age comes into play here, because there is something that happens when whiskey ages in the Scottish climate, where that each year they lose a percentage of the whiskey in the cask, and they lose a percentage of the alcohol percentage on the whiskey through evaporation. Something that's typically referred to as the angel's share. The angels take their share, and if they're greedy angels, the percentage of the whiskey will continue to go lower and lower and lower, as well as the volume of whiskey in that cask, as I mentioned. So again, 43.1%, it's still cask strength. So there's an exception to every rule. But look on the label, bottom of the label, you'll usually find it in a bottom corner. That's where you'll find the drinking strength of that whiskey. Tip number 5 is to ask yourself, is this Scotch whiskey chill filtered? Now, right away, you probably have the question, what is chill filtration and why is it important? Well, chill filtration is the process that I referenced in the last tip, where a whiskey is actually put through a mechanical process of removing lipids and fats that are already present in the whiskey, so that when the whiskey is, say, cold or has an ice cube added to it, when it's watered down, the whiskey remains clear. It doesn't go cloudy, because there's this understanding or belief that a clear whiskey is better quality than a cloudy whiskey. Now, why would this be a bad thing? Or is it a bad thing? Well, again, it comes down to personal preference. I prefer non-chill filtered whiskeys because I believe when they press the whiskey through this machine, through these cardboard filters at a low temperature to make sure that all those fats clot up a bit more so that it can catch all those fats, you're removing a lot of the good mouthfeel, a lot of the good viscosity. You're removing a lot of the flavor compounds. Fats are typically a good thing when it comes to flavor. Not for your diet, but for your whiskey. Keeping the fats in the bottle is probably a good thing. So I think if they're chill filtering the whiskey, and a lot of people will agree, you'll hear Ralphie or others comment on this. They've been kind of leading the charge against chill filtration. I believe a better whiskey is typically one that's more natural. And in this case, the most natural presentation of the whiskey is non-chill filtered. So when we're talking about our Macallan here, there is no mention on the label of it being non-chill filtered. It is under 46% alcohol, which means if it is watered down or gets cold, it is most likely to become cloudy if it's not chill filtered. The label on a bottle or on the box is kind of the contract. That's all you have to go on. That's where the promises are made. And if there's no mention, we can only assume that it has been chill filtered. So this will remain clear if you add water through your ice to it, or if you chill it. Now, instead of that, this Kilkerran on the back, and I'll turn it around here, in the back of the label, it says not chill filtered. So this whiskey, at 46%, it should still remain clear at a colder temperature. However, if you water it down, it's likely going to become cloudy. You'll get this Scotch mist sort of thing going on. I think the better delivery of whiskey is definitely the non-chilled filtered version. Now, however, that doesn't mean this hasn't been filtered at all, because inside a whiskey barrel, inside an oak barrel, there's a lot of debris. If it's been charred, there's going to be embers. There's going to be pieces of wood. So it goes through barrier filtration. And how harsh that is depending on the distillery or the bottler's preferences. Now, if you want the most natural possible presentation of a whiskey when it comes to filtration, you might want to look for something like independent bottled Blackadder. They have a product called Raw Cask. And in this, they do the lightest possible filtration that they can. And I'm going to show it to the camera here, but if I shake this up, you'll see what's been left inside the bottle. You can see there's a whole bunch of pieces of sediment, of wood, and of carbon, of basically embers from the inside of the bottle that are still in here. I think it's pretty cool. It's kind of a novelty gimmick, but that is just showing how minimal filtration they've done to this whiskey, meaning that every possible bit of that whiskey is natural. So what you prefer is up to you. To my preference, non-chill filtered is something to look at. It's positive. Look for it on the labels. Tip number 6 is to look for a Scotch whiskey that is natural color. Now, you might think, well, yeah, Scotch whiskey, it's all natural color. Unfortunately, there are some whiskeys that actually do add colorant to change the color of their whiskey. Now, this could be done for a few different reasons. One of the reasons is because of batch variation, not every bottle of whiskey would come out the same color every time. So some distilleries want to present a consistent product to their customer and have it the same color every time. So that's one of the reasons why you'd go ahead and add colorant, E150 caramel colorant to be specific, to a whiskey. And then the E150 is basically burnt sugar is the easiest way to describe that process. However, another reason why you might add color to your whiskey, or a fake colorant, is because there's a belief out there by many people that a darker colored whiskey indicates a richer, more flavorful, and sometimes possibly older whiskey, and therefore a higher quality whiskey, which just isn't true. There's plenty of whiskeys out there that are very light, pale colors that are plenty old and are also plenty flavorful. So in this case, I've got a few different examples here. We have Mortlach 16-year-old. If you look at the label, it doesn't say anything about it being natural color or non-chill filtered, just to throw that one in there again. If you look at the color, it's this rather dark color, and they do use sherry casks, which is a type of cask that can oftentimes present a color like this. But there's nothing on the label, which means they haven't given us the information to be able to determine whether it's natural color or not. I am going to assume that this has had color added to it. And if you do some digging online, Germany, for instance, every bottle of whiskey has to declare on the bottle whether or not it has colorant added to it. So usually there's some information coming out of the German market as to which bottles have color in them, which don't. Kilkerran 12-year-old right here. Once again, if we look at the label on the back, it says right beside where it says non-chill filtered, it also says natural color. Now, why is it important that it's natural color as a whiskey consumer? We can tell a lot of information from it being natural color. We can tell sometimes the cask makeup, if it had aged in bourbon casks or virgin oak casks or sherry casks or something else entirely. That can give us an idea of the flavor profile and whether or not we're going to like it. Some people don't like sherry casks. Other people, if they don't like sherry casks, maybe they like ex-bourbon cask finished whiskeys. It's going to deliver a different experience. But the biggest thing is we can actually tell something from looking at the color of the whiskey as opposed to just guessing or having something presented to us that doesn't tell us anything at all. Furthermore, over to my right, Glenallachie 10 cask strength. The color on this is unbelievable. It's only 10 years old. It's not a particularly old whiskey. But again, the color tells us a bit about the type of casks that were used and the type of flavors we can expect due to those casks being used. Furthermore, this Arran here is a wine cask finished whiskey. It's an Amarone wine cask finished whiskey. And you can see the color on it is this beautiful like rose gold color. And it wouldn't matter what color it is if it wasn't natural color. And I'm going to hold this up and you can see on the front of the label there, it does say natural color right beside the non-chill filtered. It's just one more piece of information that you have access to that can tell you whether or not to expect this whiskey being a good one and being worthwhile purchasing. All right, guys, before I get to my 7th and final tip, I just want to thank you for watching this far into this video, for sticking around this long. I really appreciate it. If you go ahead and like, comment below, share the video, or subscribe if you've enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it. If you have any more questions following this 7th tip, just leave them in the comment section below and I'll do my best job to go ahead and answer them for you. All right, so my 7th and final tip is knowing what your own personal preferences are. Now, if you're just starting off in whiskey, this can be tough, but as you try more and more whiskeys, you'll start to know whether or not, say, you are that person that wants that smooth, just proofed down 40%, easy drinking whiskey that you can have a lot of, that really does nothing for someone like me. Maybe you just want something uncomplicated that is just a pleasant drinker. The best whiskey is the whiskey you like to drink how you like to drink it. So far be it for me to tell you that that whiskey that's 40% alcohol and chill filtered and colored is not the perfect whiskey for you. Only you can determine that. However, there's other considerations too. Whether you prefer a profile like an ex-bourbon cask profile that's very tropical fruit forward, vanilla, butterscotch, these sorts of elements, or whether you prefer something like a sherry cask finish, which is very rich, so like stewed fruits, Christmas cake, chocolate, orange, like leather and tobacco and coffee sort of flavors. Very different things. Furthermore, a big one for people is whether or not a whiskey is peated. And peat is often is associated with smokiness. And it's what gives whiskeys their classic smoky signature. Now, some people will look for peated whiskeys because that's all they want to drink. Give me the heaviest peated whiskey possible. Other people are revolted by peat. They don't want to touch peated whiskeys. So if you're that person, you definitely wouldn't want to buy a peated whiskey, even if it's non-chill filtered, natural color, bottled above 46% alcohol, because you're not going to enjoy it. So know your own preferences and kind of curate your purchases to those preferences. Now, I've got Kilkerran 12-year-old on this table because I believe it's a great representative of so much that we've talked about in this video. And for instance, if we look at the front of the label, single malt Scotch whiskey. We know it's malt. We also know that it's 12-year-old single malt Scotch whiskey because it has an age statement. Then, if we go ahead and look at the back, as we mentioned before, it says at the bottom of the label, non-chill filtered natural color. And I got ahead of myself there. Back to the front, it says in the bottom corner, 46% alcohol. This whiskey pretty much ticks all the boxes of all the tips that I've told you in this video. I would highly recommend it, and it's one of my favorite whiskeys. All right, guys, once again, just let me know if you have any comments, any questions, comment down below, and I hope you come back for more in the future. Until next time, sláinte.